Ladies, gentlemen, and Spiritborn of all ages, with Vessel of Hatred now well underway, the people who blast and farm and grind a ton have already made loads of game progress. Pit Tier 100 has already been beaten by multiple people, World Tier 8 has become a comfortable place to exist for a good number of people, meaning Torment 4, but for the most part, those people have spent a ton of time on the game already and have had at least some level of luck in the positive direction to actually get them there. That said, Spiritborn as a class has a number of ways to reach a level of power that puts them able to farm very comfortably in Torment 4 quite easily. Today we're going to focus not on the build that does the most damage in Perfect Gear, though it is at least relatively competitive in Perfect Gear, but instead the build that requires the least actual effort to play or brainpower to run. The one button build strong enough to turn Torment 4 into mincemeat with the right stuff actually built around it. This is a Storm Feathers build based around infinitely evading to fire off the Eagle primary Spirit Hall skill. You've probably seen this concept whether it is in game with players zooming past you or just in videos from other creators as well. But today I'm going to put my own spin on it and show you my own take on this really fun build concept. And for those who are waiting for Quill Volley, don't worry, we will finish off that with the high-end version next time. I just wanted to do this here while it's the most relevant to the most people, and there's no time where brain-off farming is more relevant than right at the beginning. All that said, the main core engine of the damage in this build is the Eagle Spirit Hall's primary bonus, which spawns Storm Feathers when you evade, and also makes your Storm Feathers home in on an enemy when you evade towards them. We pair this with the lovely combo of the Sepizantek unique weapon, which makes every basic skill usage count as the third cast variant, and thunderspike, which not only gives you 5 seconds of evade cooldown reduction when the third cast variant happens, but also accelerated thunderspike as an enhancement, which makes your evade launch off thunderspike automatically when you press it. Because evade cooldown is by default 5 seconds, this leads to an infinite loop of evades, which lets you just fully spam evade back to back and build around this as a concept with high movement, high damage, extreme ease of use, and simplicity of actual controls, and then just enough survivability to get you through what this is really made for. That said, there does seem to be a bit of a bugged interaction as a part of this, partially fueling it, so it may well not last forever as a build. This may be something that you're only able to use while it's here, at least in its current form. Today we'll go over the full skill points that I've got for this setup then, the Spirit Hall choices of course too, the uniques and legendaries, the tempering affixes, and general affixes as well that you want to aim for, the runes, the gems, your mercenary setup, and then of course we'll talk about your Paragon board, at least up to the point where mine is at personally. Starting off with the basic skill then, we did already talk about this, but it's Thunderspike, with enhanced Thunderspike as well, and then also of course accelerating Thunderspike. This is a main fueler of our evade combo. We never need to actually cast Thunderspike manually ourselves, it does its job completely automatically as long as it's actually on the skill bar to be cast when we evade. Then we need 3 more points to be spent within this first couple of clusters to move on, so we end up taking 3 ranks of follow through as a passive for bonus damage with Thunderspike's auto cast that happen during evades. This is a very low portion of our overall damage, but it's more than literally nothing, which is what all of the other options to spend our skill points here would honestly offer us. Then we move on to the focus cluster, and here we pick up the Ravager skill. This makes any damage done to an enemy trigger a bonus strike from the skill while it is active, and passively it just gives you minimum 2 stacks of ferocity always for some attack speed. We grab the enhancement for this, which increases the duration with kills and keeps it nearly always active when doing general mob clearing content, and then we also take replenishing Ravager, which is a bit of a complex tooltip, but the long and short of it is if you have self-healing, this will store up charges as you heal yourself to give bonus hits to elites when active. This skill's damage itself is completely unimportant, but the fact that it's damage that comes from a Jaguar skill is quite relevant to a later passive that we take, which is called Potent. For now though, we grab all 3 ranks of the Mirage passive for bonus dodge chance while evading, and bonus crit chance after a successful dodge, which is quite useful. We are always evading, so we have this dodge chance, essentially this is a permanent bonus while we are actively casting evade, and we get the crit chance quite frequently as a result too. We also take 3 ranks of the Unrestrained Power passive for bonus damage while we are unstoppable, and this mostly comes from the active portion of the Armored Hide ability that we'll be activating afterwards. This will have limited uptime, but it is most useful for things like bosses. Then we take 1 rank of Focal Point as a passive, mostly just as a gateway for 3 ranks of Apex for bonus damage to vulnerable enemies. This is also doubled against bosses, which is quite good, and this specifically is the second best target for bonus passive ranks on your amulet, and it's what my amulet has, which is why I have bonus ranks here. Then we take 3 ranks of Diminishment as a passive for damage reduction to all vulnerable enemies, and with that we move on to the defensive cluster, which looks a bit funny, honestly. Here we take literally every active skill in the cluster, but we will start with Armored Hide, which we put 5 ranks into specifically to increase its active duration and lower its cooldown, in an attempt to give us as high uptime on this as possible. We also take its enhancement, which makes its cast gives us maximum stacks of the Resolve bonus, and Reinforced Armored Hide for bonus block damage reduction per close enemy while the skill is active. We then grab Concussive Stomp as a skill, and this one is fun because it doesn't actually go on your skill bar, it gets auto-cast, but in a very, very helpful way. This is a part of the bugged interaction that I mentioned earlier. The main reason that we use this skill is firstly because it counts as a guerrilla skill, secondly the enhancement that makes it give barrier per enemy hit, and thirdly for adaptable concussive strikes as a bonus too, which gives you automatic dodges against any enemy that is hit by your concussive stomp. Again, this does not actually go on your bar. You do not put this on your ability bar. We trigger it through one of our Runewords actually, and this does make it gain the bonuses from the enhancements for the skill as well, because it is a skill for our class, and that's how those work. Then we pick up Counterattack as a skill as well, which passively gives us dodge chance and makes us do a return attack against any enemy that we dodge attacks from. Then when you use the active effect, this raises our dodge chance to 100%, which is quite powerful in itself. We take the enhancement to reduce its cooldown after use per stack of ferocity you have, and then we take Reinforced Counterattack for a permanent bonus to your critical damage that stacks per close enemy that is actually nearby you. This one we mostly just try to use whenever it's off cooldown, but for the most part this is here for the critical damage bonus more than anything else. Even passively it does most of its job as a result of that, so it's really optional to even press it in the first place, unless you are doing content a bit above your pay grade stat-wise and want a bit more dodge chance. Then we take Scourge, and this is entirely for the enhancements as well. The first one giving us stacking bonus damage to crowd-controlled enemies, and Adaptable Scourge gives us just a lucky hit chance to lifesteal on hit against an enemy that is infected by Scourge. This mostly only comes up with super healthy packs of elites or against proper bosses, but it's useful when it comes up and the slot is otherwise just not much of a gain to be filled on your bar. Generally, I also pop this ability in multi-enemy combat when I am zooming through a large pack, just so it can stack up the crowd-controlled damage and boost you for a few seconds. Outside of that, we also take some passives in this cluster, 1 rank of Endurance over here, mostly just to let us put 3 ranks into Perseverance, which gives you bonus damage reduction per resolve stack that you have at any given time. This is mostly active just after casting Armored Hide, though a fun note because of all the dodge chance that we have, you actually have pretty high uptime on resolve itself because you need to be hit to drop stacks, and we don't get hit very often. We then also get 1 rank of the Patient Guard passive for the bonus block chance it gives us, and to also let us put 3 points into Auspicious. This passive gives you barrier generated per second, but taking damage removes the effect. What that specifically means then is health damage, so if you are hit without it removing your barrier, it does not reset this effect. We take bonus ranks of this on equipment, and ideally it would be 4 or 5 bonus ranks at full masterworking ranks, which would bump this up to give you upwards of like 8% maximum life as barrier per second, which is quite a lot, and helps enable our various barrier-based synergies that the build uses too, mostly from our Paragon board. With that then we move on to the Potency cluster, and here we'll be grabbing only passives. 3 ranks of Resilient for a good chunk of bonus maximum life for 10 seconds after we cast a guerrilla skill. This is where the bug will come in that I was mentioning earlier, and it's that causing Concussive Stomp to go off from the rune word counts as casting a guerrilla skill. Activates this as well as another strong bonus that we'll grab later on. Any term that says cast in this game is not supposed to actually be affected or activated by a skill that happens from anything other than being manually pressed on your skill bar. So anything like a rune casting an ability is not supposed to count for this wording, but in this specific instance it does, and it enables a good synergy for the build, which makes it reach the level that it currently does. Then we take 3 ranks of the Brilliance passive for bonus eagle skill damage per movement speed bonus, and even though it uses the term skill, it still seems to affect Storm Feathers as a damage source as it is tagged as an eagle effect specifically, so this does actually work. And then this is a very important part of the build to actually get right, 1 rank of the Acceleration passive. This is the main thing that makes this build function on Torment 4 to begin with, because this passive gives you bonus evade charges per rank, and 1 rank in this, which is what we take, is a singular bonus evade charge. If you only have the 1 evade, which is of course the standard, even with the instant reset that we get after the thunderspike hit, you would still have to wait just a little beat between evades for the thunderspike animation to actually play out and the cooldown reduction to take place. This would essentially just increase the time between between your evades enough to stop this from being a proper build. The way to counter this without this passive would be using legendary boots with the implicit bonus evade charges affix. However, this locks you off of an extremely important unique for getting our resistances to a reasonable spot, which is an incredibly important part of the process if you want to grind and farm comfortably with this in Torment 4 difficulty tier. After that, then we take 3 ranks of the potent passive over here, which I mentioned earlier. This increases all damage that you do to an enemy by a small amount each time that they take damage from one of your Jaguar skills. This is where the Ravager skill makes its use most known, as each bonus hit from Ravager scales this bonus up quicker and quicker. And while this mostly doesn't end up affecting regular enemies as they'll die too quickly, this bonus builds up quite quickly on things like elite enemies and especially bosses, where it makes a big difference quite quickly. Then we move on to our ultimate cluster, and here we'll be picking up our ultimate skill, of course, which is actually going to be the Devourer, with all 5 ranks and the enhancements as well, of course. The reason for this is pretty simple, and it has nothing to do with the damage from the ultimate itself, though the damage isn't bad, so much as the duration of the ultimate and the cooldown that it has too. With tempering rules for cooldown reduction on this specific skill, and the unique boots that we use also having a cooldown reduction affix, you can actually bring the cooldown of this ultimate below 15 seconds. The ultimate itself lasts for 15 seconds, so you can end up with permanent uptime on this. The main reason that this matters is our passives that we tank in the cluster 2, 3 ranks of Resolution, which just gives you bonus damage to elites after you cast an ultimate ability, 1 rank of Spiritual Attunement, which is just purely as a gateway to let us get 3 ranks of Supremacy. This gives you a stacking buff after you cast an ultimate skill that gives you bonus damage every time you get a kill. This continues for the entire duration of the ultimate, and it hits a very powerful bonus at maximum stacks. When your ultimate skill ends when the duration is over, you get 5 bonus stacks, and then you lose 1 stack per second. With other ultimate setups, this can be a bit hard to keep it full uptime on full stacks, but with the Devourer's duration extending past its cooldown in our setup like this, we can instead just hit it at just essentially permanent maximum stacks for this passive, which is a ton of bonus damage. Then finally, we of course have our key passive today, and this is where things get a bit spicy once again because we are using Vital Strikes. This increases your vulnerable damage by a hefty multiplier, but also makes any attack against a vulnerable enemy remove the debuff from them as well as healing you and generating resource when you do it. The trick here is this only applies to single vulnerable applications, but if you use something like the Accursed Touch Legendary, which is essentially permanently reapplying vulnerable debuff on an internal cooldown to the enemy, you can instead clear vulnerable with this key passive doing damage and have the enemy reapply vulnerable to themselves because of that effect before your next hit, meaning that the actual removing vulnerable part isn't even a thing. It removes the negatives from this key passive and just makes it a really strong multiplier with bonus effects and making it a really strong combination in this build. That just about does it for the skill tree then, so let's talk very briefly about the Spirit Hall choices. This one is pretty obvious though, honestly. Most of our build is made around the Eagle primary Hall option and the storm feathers that they create and then fire out. Then we secondarily grab the Eagle Spirit again, which gives us a stacking and resetting crit chance bonus, but this choice is mostly because it lets us make use of a specific unique we'll talk about in a moment, which boosts the hell out of the storm feather damage itself, which is our main output. That said, let's move on to our uniques and our legendaries for the build. Starting with the uniques that are absolutely required to use this build to begin with. I wouldn't even bother trying if you don't have this, and there's only technically one of those, Sepizon Tech, the unique weapon. This weapon makes every basic skill cast that you use the third cast effect. This is what enables Thunderspike's auto cast during evade to reset your evade cooldown every time. None of the stats on this really matter for our damage as far as the weapon affixes, not even the actual unique effect roll, except for dexterity specifically, mostly just for unlocking bonuses from rare nodes in your Paragon. So the only stat that you actually care about on this is dexterity, and obviously other than that, just having an ancestral version of the weapon is important for the weapon damage increase, as storm feathers as a subpower scale off of your weapon damage. Past that, there are 2 more uniques that we use. The first is Loyalty's Mantle. This gives double effect on your Spirit Hall bonuses if they use the same Guardian. So this is why we have double Eagle as our choices, and the combo makes the storm feathers that it uses very, very strong. The actual rolled numbers on the unique effect itself doesn't actually help our setup, as we don't use any Eagle skills that cost resource or have a cooldown. So again, the important part for this one is to have the item to begin with, and the most important affix actually on the item, and the one that you want to focus masterworking upgrades for, is the raw to straight up damage reduction affix for a bit of bonus survival. You can use this build without this item, but it will do essentially half of the damage, but it's still more than functional for Torment 2 or earlier. Then our final unique is Rakenoth's Wake in the boot slot. This isn't necessarily required to use the build at all, but it is required to survive thrive properly in Torment 4 difficulty tier, as they have a nice high natural all element resistance affix that you can boost with masterworking to make be the majority of your resistances, honestly. There is one other pair of boots that also has this high all element resistance stat, but this pair also has cooldown reduction as an affix, which nicely lines up to give us a secondary bonus for using them. Those two things are the only parts of the boots that matter for us. The rest of the parts don't matter at all, but without hitting masterworking procs on the all element resist affix, there's just no way to reasonably reach element resist caps on World Tier 4 without something like Tyrael's Might or elixirs and incense are taking the skulls out of our jewelry and replacing them, which, while being an acceptable choice, is unideal, as armor will convert to damage in this build, and that of course gives us armor. Moving on then, we have our legendaries, and we'll start in the amulet slot with Redirected Force. This gives you a bonus critical damage multiplier that scales off of your block chance. We have 45% block chance on our weapon by default, 55% with one of our passive choices on the skill tree, and we gain a lot more from another aspect that we'll be talking about in a minute. But it's worth noting that this also doubles its bonus for a few seconds after you successfully get a block on an attack to make this even stronger than it already is, and it's just an incredible source of scaling power for Spiritborn, especially in a build that has decent block chance. On the amulet itself, the most important stat as far as the affixes is actually by far total armor percentage gain, with second most important being percent dexterity gain, and third most being passive ranks, with potent being the ideal choice if possible for that Jaguar skill damage scaler. Back to armor percent gain though, amulets can roll with a ton of this stat on them, way more than you can reasonably get anywhere else, especially ancestral amulets, and you want to masterwork it too to try and hit as high an armor percent bonus as you can. Basically, you gain damage from armor all the way up to 4,500 armor showing up on your stat sheet in Torment 4. So it is the real long-term goal of this build and building the damage up, just getting as high armor as you physically can to make that happen. The reason for this then is the unyielding hits aspect on one of our rings. This gives you a bonus to your raw weapon damage stat depending on how much armor you have. This is a massive long-term damage output scaler, and that makes a lot of Spiritborn builds competitive at a top level just by using this. And because Storm Feathers do scale off of weapon damage, this build is no exception to that. On your rings for the actual affixes, you ideally want dexterity, maximum life, and crit chance. In our other ring slot then, I've got the Accursed Touch aspect, which we talked about earlier, and the main point of this, again, just to reiterate, is to apply a debuff to enemies that constantly inflicts vulnerable upon them, so that when we remove vulnerable using our key passive, it will go right back on them automatically due to the Vampiric Curse. Then we have our final offensive aspect, which is simply conceded, honestly, for bonus damage with a barrier active. One of our main goals with this build is high barrier uptime anyway, so this is just a nice big damage multiplier for something that we're already doing. On our gloves for the actual affixes, we aim for dexterity, flat armor gain, and crit chance. Then we have our two defensive slots with the interdiction aspect, which gives us bonus block chance per resolve stack, and this fuels directly into Redirected Force for a bunch of bonus critical damage. This is also why we pump extra ranks into the Armored Hide skill. On chest piece, we aim for maximum life, flat armor, and then actually resistance to all elements for our affixes, and this has a masterworking priority on the all resist unless you've otherwise managed to reach your caps, in which case it moves to the armor. Our final aspect then is actually Disobedience, and this is mostly a stopgap aspect, but Disobedience gives you a stacking armor increase for each bit of damage that you deal, up to 46% armor increase on an absolutely perfect roll. This is incredible specifically until you reach the point where it would put you above 4,500 armor in combat. This threshold is a bit higher if you have an imperfect roll of unyielding hits. Essentially, long term, with everything else maxed out, you should have enough armor gain from your gear that this aspect will become obsolete and need to be replaced, but it does help a ton until then, and most people will not be at that point for a while. Once you have that level of armor though, I would instead recommend replacing this with something like the aspect of Might for just pure damage reduction, or even layered wards for bonus blocked damage reduction specifically. As for tempering then, all of our offensive temper affixes are Storm Feather Potency for bonus Storm Feather damage. All of our resource slots are Devour cooldown reduction for our ultimate uptime and supremacy stacks. One defensive temper slot should be percent armor gain just to help bump your armor up a bit, but I didn't get that here obviously, and the other defensive slot is our bonus ranks to the Auspicious passive. Then finally, all of your utility slots would ideally be Barrier Generation, just to help keep that both active and at high percentages constantly. After that, we have our gems and our Runewords for the setup too. Starting off with the gems, you want emeralds in your armor for dexterity gain, mostly just for Paragon point activation in these specific nodes that do obviously require your main stat. You ideally want skulls in your jewelry for lower armor gain, but if you need to put elemental resistance gems instead because your masterworking is incomplete and you haven't reached your caps, there is honestly nothing wrong with replacing some of these for element resistance. It just lowers your damage until you're able to change it back. But survivability is more important than damage in the sense that if you're dead, you just won't be doing any damage to begin with, and resistances are a very important part of keeping you alive. Then we have our Runewords for the setup, and one of these is within our weapon, one in the armor, just because the additive bonus from weapon gems is relatively little compared to the more dexterity that we can get from this and the rare nodes that this can open up on the Paragon board. Our first and most important rune word then is Semtzik, which is the ritual rune to give offering on every evade that we cast, and the invocation rune to invoke Concussive Stomp, the Spiritborn skill. This is what makes us cast Concussive Stomp every time that we evade 4 times, which in turn is the main bug of this build actually, as this rune word invoking activates Unyielding Hits, which is supposed to require Gorilla skill cast to stay active, specifically the word cast, and this shouldn't work, but it does, and otherwise this build would simply not be able to accomplish the combo as it currently stands. The other rune word combo that you would ideally have would be offering gain when you move, combined with Gar, which is stacking crit chance gain when you activate it. I don't have the legendary ritual rune for offering on movement myself yet, which is of course the one that I recommend. Hopefully soon. This is what I've done for the meantime. Then past that we have our mercenary choices as well, and our primary mercenary is going to be Rahir, who you can take 2 separate ways with this depending on your stats. If your resistances are in need of more help still, you want to go down the right side path here through the resistance gain passive node, and then all the way down to inspiration as a passive, as this does give us a couple of damage multiplier opportunities from his attacks as well. Otherwise, if your resistances have been met, go down the left side instead for the bonus armor passive for more weapon damage as a result, and then through to Mocking Lure for bonus damage to enemies that are taunted by Rahir. For our reinforcement, we're going to be taking Varyana with Bloodthirst cast whenever we use a skill in combat for a bit of bonus attack speed, just because we can, and because they aren't really just any better gains from the reinforcement slot in this setup. Finally then, for actual setup, we of course have our Paragon board with the points that I have spent so far. Starting with the starting board, then you want to head up the right side through to the glyph socket itself. Inside of this first one, we're going to be putting the Fulminate glyph. This increases all lightning damage done and gives bonus lightning damage to both healthy and injured enemies as a secondary bonus. This is a decent damage gain within itself, but it is incredibly important to one of our legendary Paragon nodes that gives us a massive bonus. So this glyph should also be your first priority to upgrade for that specific reason. We collect then just enough dexterity to actually activate the bonus effect, but then we also grab all intelligence in the radius, as that's what the actual lightning damage additive effect scales off of. This is a weird glyph in the way it functions, but that's how it works. In an ideal world, you would have this set up to reach around 140% additive lightning damage on the glyph, and if your upgrading takes it past that, eventually you can start to drop intelligence nodes here for use elsewhere. But with the lightning damage multiplier on the glyph included, we need our overall bonus to lightning damage to be around 150%, getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, but we then take the rare and magic nodes of relevance here as well. Then we exit out of the board on the top side and attach the Viscous Shield board. Here we're going to be taking a detour out left for the barrier generation and critical strike damage rare and magic nodes. Then we round up over here to the legendary node itself. This gives you bonus damage for every 3% of our health that we have as a barrier, and this is our main barrier synergy and a big reason that we lean so far into barriers themselves in this build. We then go through the crit damage rare node here to get towards the glyph socket itself, and inside of this glyph socket we have the Spirit glyph for bonus critical damage, as well as stacking bonus damage to an enemy every time that you get a crit against them up to a cap. The legendary effect of this glyph as well is bonus damage to elites, and it's 8%, which is a very high multiplier for the legendary bonuses. All of these things are just really good for us. It's just a really solid glyph for this setup. We then take the other rare nodes in the radius, as well as of course all of the dexterity that you can afford to. If you have had the full 328 Paragon points, we take every dexterity node in the radius if we could, but you'll need to limit yourself a bit for now to let you reach further boards and further nodes. After this, we actually head to the right side of the board through the armor and maximum life rare node over here, then up through the damage reduction while barriered rare node as well, as that's quite good, and we go outside the right to attach the sapping board. We head up through the all element resist rare and magic nodes that are near the entrance and up over to the actual legendary node itself. What this does is does give us a boost to damage every time that we use 3 skills of the same guardian 3 times in a row. This counts for the thunderspike that is cast by evade, so every time you evade 3 times in a row, you get this damage buff applied to you, which makes it just consistent. We then head down to the glyph socket itself through another all-element resist and armor, rare and magic node cluster, and over to the socket here, which is going to be canny in this slot. This gives you bonus non-physical damage, so elemental damage. This is specifically because our main output is all lightning damage, and this boosts it a fairly large amount just by existing, really. We take the additive damage rare node that's in here, and then just enough intelligence to activate the glyph effect, and then we move back to the viscous shield board, and this time we're going to be heading out the left side here and attaching on the convergence board. First we head down to the glyph socket itself for the board, inside of which we'll be putting the jagged plume glyph. If you have less Paragon points than I do here, you will want to move this to an earlier board because it's an extremely important glyph for the setup and for your damage. This is its ideal placement once you're actually able to unlock it. This gives us straight up damage bonus with storm feathers, and also gives us a stacking buff when we create a storm feather, which we do constantly, so we have this buff at maximum stacks just permanently. We take both of the rare nodes in the radius as well, and as much dexterity as we can spare, as this one again is a really important damage scaler that would be fully filled out if we had 328 Paragon points. Then we head up through the armor and all element resist rare and magic node cluster once again, and we go to the legendary node itself, which is convergence. This gives you a bonus up to 30% damage multiplier, which is equal to 20% of your 2 top elemental damage bonuses. This is not affected by the non-physical damage increase stat, as that is its own thing. It doesn't actually count for this, so the canny glyph and the affix on our boot specifically do not contribute to this effect, and that's important to note. The only thing we have that does contribute to it is the fulminate glyph, and its legendary bonus lightning damage increase multiplier 2. In order to get the full 30% damage bonus from this legendary node, you need to reach 150% bonus lightning damage from the fulminate glyph specifically, and its multiplier as well. And it makes a really strong combo if you do that. Then for the final board, for the 5th board, if I had more points, I would add it to the top of the viscous shield, and the best remaining board to add on would be the drive board, mostly because it gives you damage when you move and will be moving constantly, and also the damage reduction while moving rare node that it has too, which is obviously very good because you are moving all the time and evading counts as moving, so it all works together. The Paragon glyph that we would want to have in that board then would be Talon for bonus damage with eagle skills, bonus critical strike damage with eagle skills, and then just another bonus lightning damage legendary multiplier at the end. That does it for all of how to actually put the build together then, so let's talk about playing it, and this one is actually super simple. You want to use Armored Hide whenever you can, counterattack Ravager and the Devourer, essentially just on cooldown every time it's available. Use Scourge when around a particularly large pack of enemies, a pack of elites, or against a boss to both build up stagger meter and give you bonus damage with the stagger happens too, and give you some lifesteal as well. Outside of that, literally you want to just spam evade. My main tip for this is that I rebound evade to my left click and move and interact to spacebar, which was a bit awkward to get used to, sure, but this build literally just wants you to hit evade as fast as you can and consistently as well, and it's way easier to do that with left click because you can't hold down evade to evade multiple times in a row. You have to hit the button over and over. Especially as you still move while evading, it isn't that odd to change your keybinds like this until you go to start like trying to pick up items off the ground. You have to use spacebar and it's a bit odd, but that's entirely just a choice based around your own comfort. Use this however you need to, bind it however you have to. That just about does it for today then, everyone. My own take on the Storm Feathers evade spam build concept for Spiritborn that has been taking the world by storm. Pun intended. This thing is the simplest build to play that I've done since like Andariel's Barrage on Rogue, if not even easier than that, honestly, and the power level that it reaches is more than enough to get you farming in World Tier 4. So if that is the greatest height that you aspire to, then this build will get that job done. If you are someone like me who wants to get absolutely perfect gear for other Spiritborn builds, this is also a really great build to farm and grind within because it requires very little actual attention to be paid and has insane traversal speed from point A to point B. So once you have this set up, you can use it to very easily farm other things. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and hopefully you enjoy using this build in-game as well if you try it out. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.